For more than 5 years, the entertainment industry and its cronies have all been lying to us, telling us that yes, Rian Johnson would be getting a new movie, even a trilogy after The Last Jedi, and that it would be within the Star Wars universe. And yet, for all of that crowing, for all of that misinformation, it just took us 5 years to get to the truth. Let's dive in. Explaining entertainment, keeping you ahead of the culture curve. It's what we do each and every day here on the WDW Pro channel. We've been doing that for years, despite the fact that this channel is only 3.5 months old. That does not preclude the fact that I have been saying now for years and years that Rian Johnson was not getting a sequel series of Star Wars movies. That in spite of the media and Rian Johnson himself continuously saying that that was the opposite, that they were actually going to go ahead with Star Wars. Now, you may recall that Rian Johnson is he is the architect behind the destruction of the franchise. He is the one who decided to invert the hero's journey. Rather than Luke Skywalker becoming a Jedi Master, he became a hermit. He became a shadow of his former self. He became a recluse, and he became someone that is not worthy of praise. He was lackluster, to say the least. And so Rian Johnson, having wiped out Star Wars, then, we were all supposed to believe that he would get rewarded for that, but that's not the case at all. That's not to say that Lucasfilm would not like to reward him. They probably would. The problem is that The Last Jedi introduced a downfall, a spiral for that franchise, which now has gone on over and permeated Marvel, it's permeated Disney animation, and has largely wiped out the entire company. Now, they'll recover, sure, but it needs to be said that Rian Johnson's vision, and perhaps this was predicated by something that Kathleen Kennedy wanted in the Lucasfilm story group, but Rian Johnson really is the catalyst for the fall of Disney, of Robert Iger's vision, of all of that. He's the catalyst, but they all bought in as well. But when it all comes down to what has happened, the market has rejected their vision of Star Wars, but more importantly, their philosophy, returning heroes and what makes a hero. You see, people want to believe in something. People want heroes to lead and to be good and to be virtuous. They want something to hang their hat on at the end of the day. In a world filled with confusion and all sorts of difficult things, they want to believe that somebody or something can get them across that line. In Star Wars, that was always the Force. In the real world, perhaps it's the divine. Whatever the case may be, people for decades now had decided that Luke Skywalker was somebody worth following. Not following in the way of some sort of religion or cult, but following in the way that they tried to emulate his spirit in the real world. And for that, George Lucas had really delivered a gift to us all. Let me give you some examples. I have a very good friend who, when we went to Disney World one time, we got off the Star Tours ride, and this was probably 15 years ago. And upon exiting into the gift shop, he stopped and stayed for an hour looking at all the different lightsabers and the different bits of merchandise. He's a normal guy. In fact, he's really cool. And when we went through that gift shop, he became a Star Wars nerd because it took him back to his childhood. And he had taken all of that iconography of Star Wars, all of the chivalry of the lightsabers and the Jedi, and he had integrated that into his personality to some degree. And back in the recesses of his childhood, when he walked into that souvenir shop, he was overtaken with joy. And so I went and sat on a bench and waited for him to finish. I didn't want to rush him because, maybe I wanted to go ride Tower of Terror or Rock and Roller Coaster or whatever. But his happiness was found in that gift shop for a while. And there was no need to try to get him out of there. That was a place for him to just enjoy. He's a really big Star Wars fan. I've got another Star Wars fan too. This guy's name is Matt. He grew up in Alaska. And Matt didn't have a dad in his household, didn't have a dad at home to look up to. And so, for whatever reason, he came to love Star Wars. And I guess you can see why he latched on to the Luke Skywalker character. And so he would watch Star Wars movies every single night on a VHS tape going to bed. He would watch one of the three movies and fall asleep to it. He can quote you the Star Wars movies line by line. And that character really meant something to him because Luke Skywalker redeems his father. And somewhere in that story, my friend Matt found something virtuous that he could hang on to. Whether or not he was ever able to reconnect or fix that relationship or even find his dad, he found something good in Luke Skywalker in that story. Star Wars had a dramatic impact on him. I look around at these other channels like Force of Light and like Echo Based Network. I look at the how well Lauren Connor knows everything about this franchise. And I realize that there's important and good things in that in all of these stories. All of these people are bigger Star Wars fans than I am. That's not to say that I'm not. I really, really like the franchise. At least I did. And I really like the characters. And I take note of how impactful they are. But it hurts me to see these people who they loved it. They really, really loved this story. And it touched them on a deep psychological and even spiritual basis. And then people came in and took it and changed it and made it something that it was not. They could have made their own thing, but they didn't want to. They wanted to take something that many people loved and they wanted to invert the meanings behind it. And so that's why I have not enjoyed watching Lucasfilm and Rian Johnson and the media perpetuate a lie that he was going to be rewarded with more movies because we knew that wasn't true. And we knew it wasn't true because the market resoundingly responded and said, no. The Last Jedi had a precipitous drop-off compared to The Force Awakens. And then that led into even more cataclysmic drop-offs for the following movies. Today, Star Wars is not an evergreen property. It's highly damaged. It's lost space in merchandising. And now we're all wondering, will there ever be another movie? I guess there will, but it may not be soon. And finally, we're getting the truth. Rian Johnson's Star Wars trilogy was scrapped by Disney. Now, this happened a long time ago, but only now is the media willing to truly explain and report on it. This comes to us from Small Screen, which is a publication out of the United Kingdom, and the author is Edward Lauder. Let's read. Rian Johnson has been tied to a new Star Wars trilogy for what feels like an eternity now. Well, that's what happens when that's not actually the case and you just continue to perpetuate a falsehood. It was first announced by Lucasfilm President Kathleen Kennedy before, and that's the key here. Ladies and gentlemen, pay attention to before Star Wars The Last Jedi was released in cinemas, which really goes to show you just how poorly Kathleen Kennedy had judged the quality of that film and how the market would react. She thought it was going to be a resounding success. It was not. It was not. And the media, whatever they might say, pragmatically, we can now see that it's not, because had it been a success, why would they not reward him with more movies? And yet, they're not going to. I remember that at the time, people were excited to see what Johnson could do with his own Star Wars trilogy. Well, there are people who are excited about a lot of weird things, but I tend to pay attention to what the majority of people are saying. This new trilogy was going to be separate from the Skywalker saga. Sounds a lot like The Last Jedi, which I personally was really looking forward to watching. And no hate to those who enjoyed The Last Jedi. I know those are few and far between, but no hate to those individuals. However, then The Last Jedi was released in cinemas, and it was an incredibly divisive Star Wars movie, correct? The fandom was split, yes, and probably the majority disliked it. Some people loved it, true, and a lot of people hated it. Also very true. I like this writer. Many people thought it was just okay. That said, what was definitely the case was that the movie put the Star Wars franchise in a really tricky position, especially when it came to the conclusion of the sequel trilogy. Well, that's what happens when you end all of the interesting things about your trilogy in the second part of the trilogy. That's how that goes bankrupt real quick, is when you tie up all the loose ends and you eradicate interest. J.J. Abrams had real issues writing and directing The Rise of Skywalker. Yes, among other things. They ended up going back to Emperor Palpatine, which I think was a mistake, yes. But it seems as though Abrams and company thought there was no other way out of the hole that Johnson's movie landed them in. And that hole still exists for all of Star Wars, by the way. It's called the sequel trilogy, and people still are refusing to go back and watch anything Star Wars because they know that all the stories go back to the sequel trilogy, which they loathe. We recently heard reports that Disney and Lucasfilm had scrapped Patty Jenkins' Rogue Squadron Star Wars movie. Correct. That was quickly followed up with the news that they had also shelved Kevin Feige's Star Wars movie. Correct. Which was a shame. Maybe. Michael Waldron, the writer of Doctor Strange: The Multiverse of Madness, had been tapped to pen that movie script. However, they aren't moving forward with it anymore. The only Star Wars movies that were still officially, in quotes, in development were Taika Waititi's movie. And by the way, we essentially know that's not being made now. He's basically admitted such. The film that Lost creator Damon Lindelof was writing, and we now know that he's exited, and then Johnson's Star Wars trilogy. However, we have now learned that Lindelof has left his Star Wars project, and by the way, just weeks before Star Wars Celebration, and although they say that it's still in development, they've been saying that about Rian Johnson's trilogy for how long? They've got one individual working on that movie, and we put working in quotation marks. I do not anticipate it coming out in the late 2025 window that they had said. That movie is still in development, the writer says, which I guess is technically the case also if you believe that Rian Johnson's trilogy was ever in development. However, Lindelof won't be writing it anymore. We also learned that Waititi wants to star in his movie set in a galaxy far, far away, which was kind of to be expected. He loves to star in his own stuff. And again, he's essentially said he's not making one. According to our sources, it looks like Disney and Lucasfilm have decided to pull the plug on something that was never plugged in. I inserted that, okay, folks? I inserted that. To pull the plug on Rian Johnson's Star Wars trilogy. This shouldn't come as much of a surprise, mainly because there's been so little movement on his trilogy for a while now. And by that we mean it's been set in park and never moved ever. Just know, he was promised this trilogy before The Last Jedi came out. After The Last Jedi came out, it has been an absolute train wreck for the entire franchise. Now, why? Why did they say that he would get a trilogy, and why have the media covered for him for so long? Well, that comes down to something deeply philosophical. You see, if the media and if Lucasfilm admit that, or if they had admitted that Rian Johnson was not getting his trilogy, then that would have been admitting that The Last Jedi was a failure. And that's a problem because if you admit that The Last Jedi was a failure, then you admit that the story behind it is a failure. And the story behind it is something that many of those in Hollywood and Lucasfilm have fully bought into. That is cynicism, postmodernism, nihilism, and more. But they're having to come to grips with the hard reality that the market has said no. The market, and that's us, that's society. The market doesn't want heroes based in cynicism. That's the opposite of heroism. We want heroes who overcome. We want heroes who teach us that there's great meaning in life and that meaning is worth fighting for. Not those who go and isolate themselves from everything else and pass away by transplanting themselves in some sort of crazy holographic vision to another planet where they exhaust themselves just by doing some sort of magic trick. That's crazy. We want something to believe in, both in fiction and in life, because fiction should reflect life. Lucasfilm has given up on all of those deeper meanings. They want cynicism. They want nihilism. They want to question all the truths that we hold dear with postmodernism. There's just one problem. We don't. According to this source, the last I've heard, Disney has given Johnson's trilogy the axe, said an insider about Johnson's Star Wars trilogy. It's hard to axe that which doesn't exist. They went on to add the following. It's been problematic for Disney and Lucasfilm as they love Johnson and his work. That is very true. Yes, they do. But they just cannot get past the fans' poor reaction to The Last Jedi. Darn it, if it just weren't for our consumers. You know, we love this. We love these poison pills. We just wish you would take them. The insider then added that both parties are in agreement that the best thing to do is move on and part ways. And on that, finally, we can definitely all agree. The Last Jedi was an abysmal failure, a huge mistake, and the destruction of a hero for many, many people. It needs to be not only not continued in the way of giving Rian Johnson more movies, but ultimately I've come to the conclusion that there's no way around it. It's going to have to be retconned somehow. People hate it that much. Folks, if people hate something that much, there's a good chance that whatever you think of it, you may have made a mistake. That's the show for today. We'll be talking about some of the impacts that these huge mistakes Disney's content creators have made are having in terms of an impact on the company tomorrow morning, where we'll be talking about the huge layoffs coming to the company that once was king and now is teetering on the edge of being at the top no more. If you like content like this, consider clicking the like button, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Remember, when you do, you stick it to those algorithms. We covet your comments, so drop one down below. And wherever you are, whatever you're doing, keep learning, keep growing, and keep having fun.